Welcome to the 85th episode of the New Ventures podcast. I am your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regain Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. Along with my co-host, Professor Jaideep Prabhu, I host this series of conversations to understand the links between climate change and food security.
Hi, I'm Jaideep Prabhu. I'm a professor of marketing at Cambridge Judge Business School. My area of research is innovation, particularly frugal innovation, how organizations of different sizes are able to innovate faster, better, and cheaper. And through that interest in frugal innovation, I've become interested in food security and innovation in that space. I'm delighted to be joining Sanjoy on this podcast.
Our guest for today is Hack Stiernblad, the Chief Growth Officer of SunCulture, which provides solar irrigation solutions to farmers in Kenya. Welcome, Hack.
Thanks so much, and it's a great pleasure being here today.
It's wonderful to have you. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm Hack, Chief Growth Officer at SunCulture. I grew up on a farm in Sweden, so definitely from a farming roots background, and then studied electronic engineering. And then in 2014, I moved to Kenya from Sweden and joined SunCulture when it was just a small little company, and essentially started on the engineering side and then grew up into business development role when we started to do country expansion. And today I'm the Chief Growth Officer and in charge of all our expansion, business development, policy work, and also donor funding.
And what was that like, moving from Sweden to Kenya and Nairobi in particular?
Oh, it was very exciting, I have to say. It was fantastic, very, very different in very many ways, but I would say in almost every aspect, very positive, coming straight from university into a very fast-moving, very exciting environment, not only from Kenya and Africa and its nature and animals and everything, but also the type of people in Kenya is excellent. And I would say also the startup scene has just exploded over the last 10 years I've been there. So it's been a fantastic journey.
I'm curious about that startup scene because I've heard about that too. What's driving it?
I think obviously Kenya has always had a relative open economy, relative stability, which has attracted a lot of VC funds over the years. Obviously, Kenya has also very leapfrog technology when it comes to smartphone, internet. There's really good 4G across the country. And that has enabled fintech, health tech, climate tech to really explode. I mean, obviously, M-Pesa, the first mobile money transfer technology in the world, was launched in Kenya. And I think that really snowballed a lot of these technology companies as well.
For those of our audience who have not read this book by Jaideep, How Governments Should Be, please do read it because it has a wonderful chapter on how the mobile money innovation came about in Kenya as a part of a almost collaborative effort between the regulator and the private business. And that's kind of where he suggests on how frugally innovations can propagate in the emerging countries. So, Hack, let me go back to SunCulture. A lot of us who have worked in the off-grid solar industry in particular know about SunCulture. But do introduce your company to our audience.
Yes, SunCulture essentially is a solar-powered irrigation company, which is solely focusing on the smallholder farmers. So we sit right in that nexus between the solar energy space and the agriculture space. And essentially, we enable farmers to get access to irrigation and obviously be able to do that. Hardware, you might think when you say here solar irrigation, you're thinking of the hardware, a solar water pump, a sprinkler irrigation system, but that is obviously only one part of the solution. So to get this technology in the hands of the smallholder farmer, obviously need to build awareness and trust around this technology. It's one of the most expensive things that these farmers ever bought in their life. They may probably haven't even seen or heard about the solar water pump before. And even when you have built that trust, obviously they need to afford that technology. Financing is the other critical part that we need to do. Then the fourth one, distribution, delivery, installation, customer service. And then fifth, which is the latest building block in our business, is around our carbon credit program, which we further use to reduce the price of our product. So that's in short is our business and what we do today.
So, Hack, as Chief Growth Officer, what is your typical day like?
It's a good question. It's very, very varying, I have to say. I'm jumping a lot currently. I'm jumping a lot between the donor and policy work. So obviously manage all the result-based financing grants that are available, planning for donor funding for expansions that are upcoming, a lot of discussions with the World Bank as well on these subjects. And then going into the very more operational, so the market expansion. We have now, in the last 1.5 years, we launched SunCulture Uganda, and we also have a joint venture in Ivory Coast with our investor, EDF, the French utility company. And so jumping from how we grow their sales, how we grow the partnerships there, operational IT problems, and then the more high-level donor policy. We're bouncing between there a lot at the moment.
I teach international marketing and growth. One of the frameworks is, you always have a trade-off between penetrating your existing market deeper versus going to new markets. So you mentioned being in Kenya, of course, but you also mentioned Ivory Coast. Could you talk us through how that came about? What were some of the trade-offs and how you made that decision?
Yeah, I think it was something that was really splitting us as a company as well. Should we expand? Should we just drill down on one country? I think one driving factor was a bit almost like a risk mitigation. Obviously, we saw a huge demand in these countries, first of all, both Uganda, Ivory Coast, and in many other countries. There is enormous demand for solar irrigation. So the demand is almost not the question. But obviously, we see the demand and then you sit, okay, does our current product portfolio fit within that demand? And that's a very important part because solar irrigation is not just one product. It is depending on how deep the water source is, how big the farmers is, what crop did we grow. It's a bit more technical. But the other main high-level strategic factor was risk mitigation. Africa, compared to the developing world, a very high-risk environment. It's sparse. We have seen multiple coups. We have had many demonstrations in Kenya. Currency is dropping, collapsing. It's a very high-risk environment. So to be dependent on only one country in Africa as a company, it becomes a very high-risk environment for that company. So that was also driving back. Then, of course, Ivory Coast was a joint venture and driven by EDF, which is a French utility company, and there was a very strong roots and history and connection in the West Francophone part of Africa. So that also was another way of really utilizing them as a strategic investor into that joint venture.
Solar irrigation is not just a product, and it depends on various factors like how deep the water source is, what type of crops the farmers grow. I find that very fascinating, what you said. Can you help us understand your product range?
Yes, it depends a little bit on the market, but let's say around 60 to 70% of our farmers are rain-fed farmers today. So these are farmers who are just planting maybe one or maybe twice per year, depending on the location, and then hoping for the rain. And they are mainly growing these staple food crops in Kenya. It's mainly maize. And those are then the majority of our customers. So obviously then we install our solar irrigation product, and that helps them not only, of course, irrigate the farm, but it also gives the water to the household and get access to water to the animals. So they are doing farming, they're doing household, they're doing animals, they're doing selling water. It's a multi-business perspective that they have. And I would say that's our entry-level product then. So that's the low-cost product. It's a direct solar panel that pumps directly to the pump, and then you can pump that water directly to the field or to a tank. And then from there, we have the battery solution. It's a quite unique solution. And when it comes to this kind of scale, then we enable the farmer to pump continuously whenever they want. And an important aspect there is that the farmer can pump early morning when evaporation is low and it's a bit cooler on the African continent. And they can do the irrigation early morning when it's the best time for the plants and from an evaporation perspective. But also then they can go and do other work during the day. And with that, they then also get sprinkler irrigation, which is more efficient than flood irrigation and also time saving. And then from there, they can then upgrade to the drip irrigation solution. Drip irrigation is the most efficient technology we have today with irrigation. It suits more for the high value crops like tomatoes and onions, etc. Then that we really want to see the farmer essentially moving from that rain-fed, moving into irrigation, simple manual irrigation, moving into sprinkler irrigation, and moving into drip irrigation. And of course, depending on where the farmer is today, they could go to any of those steps. But then just quickly on that, I know I'm a bit long here on the product, but it's quickly on, it's just that obviously then the water source. So they could have a river, they can have a well, they can have a borehole, and they could be different elevation differences up from the river up to where the farm or the borehole could be different depth. And also the farm, of course, can have different sizes. And a smallholder farmer size is actually different depending on which country you are in. So you need to have a range that are a bit flexible to meet most of the demands. But if you want to meet every single use case there is out there, you will end up with a massive product portfolio and it will become really hard to standardize.
I have a question of the customers. I know you mentioned this, that you are really targeting the smallholder farmers, and I've just emerged from a project in Southern Africa, actually, in Zambia. And one of the things that I noticed there is a large number of large-scale commercial farms. Is that not your customer at all?
No. We have our whole core and mission vision is to focus on the smallholder farm. That has been our focus from the start. The reason for that is obviously that's where we saw the highest impact. Most of the commercial farmers are maybe doing irrigation today. They probably have access to financing. They have access to training. It's a completely different kind of business. And therefore you often see two different kind of companies focusing on one end of this market. But, we know that the smallholder farmers not only is the biggest opportunity, 30% of the world's food today is around 30% of the world's food today is produced by smallholder farmers. And in Africa, it's even more. And we know they also have access to a significant part of the unused arable land of the world today. And 65% of that land sits in Africa. We knew that was the biggest impact and also the biggest uptake. These farmers have, as I mentioned, they don't have irrigation today. So to upgrade them to irrigation and this modern technology, we saw as the biggest opportunity.
You're right, because in Zambia, where I worked, these farms have definite access to bank finance, sometimes even external capital, like external to the country, that is. The impact that you're going to create with smallholder farmers is going to be significant.
Absolutely. And also thinking of climate change and what's happening now. I mean, these smaller farmers probably contributed zero almost to the climate change and carbon emissions. At the same time, they are bearing the highest impact of it right now, and they are already impacted of it. And it's very tough and sad to see, to be honest, that in Zambia, now where you came from, they have the biggest drought almost in 100 years ongoing right now. Essentially, a whole rainy season completely cancelled. In Kenya, 4 of the last 5 years has had significant drought, and it is the smaller farmers, especially the rainfed farmers, that are being they're affected by this. We also see that the urgency is for the smallholder farmers to transition from this rainfed agriculture.
Could I ask about the water issue? Because from what I know about India, for instance, sometimes farmers are given electricity for free. So they're not using solar, they're using grid electricity or other sources of electricity. But what that results in is excess use of water. They pump water, and then the level of water, the aquifers, are starting to dry up. Is that a concern for you? How do you address that?
It's a major concern, and we definitely want to avoid what has been happening in India as much as possible. Obviously, the case is completely different. Massive subsidies, highly unregulated in terms of like how we should use that water, what kind of irrigation technology should you use it. And obviously, the subsidies we were talking about in India is 80-90%. Even if you only needed a 3 horsepower pump, if you only pay 90% of the cost, you would obviously buy a 5 or a 6 or 7 horsepower pump either way to ensure that you have future-proofed it. Obviously, in Africa, we don't have this kind of subsidies. So for us, first of all, we had to reduce the size of the product as much as possible, because obviously the bigger the product, the more expensive, the more solar panels you need. So we had to reduce it. Our pumps are doing, we're talking about maybe 1 cubic liter per hour up to 3 cubic liter per hour. It's tiny, tiny pumps compared to what you see in India. So I think that's one aspect. The second aspect, as I mentioned before, is that how you use the water. I mean, to be honest, in my opinion, we should probably see a ban of irrigation. Like it should only be sprinkler and then only drip irrigation that these pumps should be used. If we do that, we significantly reduce the water output. Of course, also significantly increase the initial investment cost. But I really see that there needs to be regulated on that water being extracted and how it's being applied of the crops. And that is, of course, what we're trying to do, holistically as well with adding on those kind of irrigation technologies.
Why is drip irrigation more expensive than sprinkler and just a manual?
Manual, of course, then you just have a pipe, you're just walking around, with your hand, and it's very little technology. A sprinkler, of course, is just a sprinkler, and you maybe let it run for 45 minutes and then you move it again after 45 minutes. So also relatively simple, but of course it irrigates everywhere. And drip irrigation, of course, is a very specific, so you only drop the water exactly where the plant is. And for that, you need a lot of piping. You need piping, you need drip lines along this bed. You need to have pressure regulators. It's not a very advanced technology. It's just essentially these pipes, and then you have these drip emitters. So it's very simple. If you want to do that on multiple acres, it really drives up the cost. But it also reduces the cost of the size of the pump. There is a balance there where if you could do drip irrigation from the start, you could actually reduce the solar pump size drastically. So there is a handover, but overall, it becomes more expensive.
So there must be some sort of performance limit on what a solar pump can do relative to a diesel or a petrol pump. Am I correct?
No, there's no limit. It's the same. It's just that it will become immensely expensive, the upfront cost, if you want to get into the same sizes as diesel and fuel pumps.
So solar pumps can be as powerful as the diesel pumps?
Yes, they can.
That's very interesting. So a policy implication of what you're saying is government, if they're subsidizing anything, they should be subsidizing solar pumps and drip irrigation.
Exactly. So, and I think that's what I was trying to say. We almost normally say we don't sell a solar water pump. We sell a solar irrigation solution. And that irrigation solution needs to include a type of irrigation technology, either sprinkler or drip. And that is, they need to change how they're doing that. And I know World Bank, etc., are thinking the same way. Often what we see, the VAT and duty exemptions that we have in some of our countries are for a complete irrigation solution and not just for the solar water pump.
But, just help us understand this a little bit better, because this word expensive, I want to drill down into this a little bit more in detail. I have a 2-acre farm. I'm growing tomatoes. My farm is rain-fed, and I buy a basic pump. How much does that cost? Then I maybe add on a battery because I feel that I want to irrigate in the morning. Then I add on a drip irrigation. Just tell me about the journey a little bit, about how much money I have to spend.
Yes, you have the cash price, right? Which obviously is almost irrelevant to the smallholder farmers. But our cash price, which is in Kenya now as an example, the cheapest product starts around $350, $400, which is the entry-level product. If you want a battery, then you can go up to $700, $750. But these prices are highly subsidized. They're subsidized with the carbon credits that we generate. And there is also a different RBF program that we have with several donors that we are using to reduce the price of the product. But the more relevant is the pay-go, as a pay-as-you-go, or what we call the pay-as-you-grow price. And then we will pay a deposit. There's a credit survey, and then you pay a monthly fee. That deposit is around $30 to $50, depending on the product. And then you pay between $20 to $35 per month, depending on the product. And that is really what is important. And they need to be able to afford that monthly cost, especially since it takes some time before they generate money from the agriculture side. They need to go through a season or two.
So $25, $30 per month, 3 years, and that includes drip irrigation or does not?
2 to 3 years. That is either for basic irrigation, like manual irrigation, or sprinkler irrigation. Yes, then if you want a drip, you need to add that in. And then it can go up to almost $1,000 cash price and around $70 deposit, and then around $40 per month.
So, Jaideep, that is where the interesting thing is, from what I understand. The drip irrigation, the technology is not necessarily, very high tech, but the piping costs do add on substantial prices to the monthly payments.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I wonder if we can now get into the supply chain question. So, Hack, I'm curious to know, where are all these components manufactured? How long is the supply chain? What is the cost structure there? The pumps and these components and so on. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, most of the items are manufactured in China today. For us, pricing in balance with quality is everything. So if we can find good quality products that are the same or lower price locally, we obviously buy them. So today we usually buy all the piping locally. We buy some of the electric cables locally, depending on the countries and what kind of manufacturing they have in that country. But apart from that, almost everything else is buy in China. We have long lead times. We developed the controller, everything ourselves. So some of these PCB components, and especially during this PCB drought that we have in China a few years back, some of this lead time could be 6-8 months to buy these PCB components, to build up the power circuit and the board on the controllers. So, but normally today I would say it's 1 to 2 months or 1 month for the PCB components. It's then a 2-month assembly or manufacturing timeline, 1 month to ship it, or 2 to 4 weeks to ship it, and then another week or two to clear it. There are very long lead time, unfortunately, which is also driving up the cost of the business.
And did you face these major sort of supply chain blockages during COVID? How did you deal with that?
Oh, yeah, it was painful. To be honest, we ran out of stock multiple times over the years. We had to almost stop the battery solution because the battery needs so many more components. So we had to reduce the sales of that, focus on the more simpler products where we could get some of the components. But it was, and obviously our cost of the goods sold, buying these components became so expensive. We tried to manage, but it was very, very hard. And, we know that it was very hard even for the Apples and the Googles of the world to get hold of these components. So for a small company like us, it became almost impossible.
Speaking of pumps, I'm from South India, and there's a city called Coimbatore, which is supposedly the pump capital of the world. That's what I was told when I visited. Do you have any idea of pumps from India versus China?
Yeah, we've been looking quite a lot of India, especially from a secondary supply chain, if something would happen with the China supply chain. Unfortunately, today I have to say that India, they have great pump and they have a really, really big industry, obviously very driven by the subsidy program that the government has had for so many years. But price-wise, what we've seen, they have a tough time competing with the Chinese manufacturing. And we also see that Indian manufacturers are maybe not as holistic integrated as some of the Chinese manufacturers who would do all the casting themselves, they would do all the wiring themselves, even electric wires from the pump together with product development. And there are definitely some in India as well, but yeah, we see it's just a bit more integrated in China, and therefore I think they can do lower cost. And of course, a government that really is supporting with the input, the cost of the metals and the coppers, etc.
How do you sell your pumps?
Yeah, no, that is a very good question, and it's not an easy feat. This product, as mentioned before, it's a very new product for smallholder farmers. In Kenya, they maybe have heard of this product. If you go to Togo, they probably maybe not even heard of irrigation. So it's a very different pitch depending on where you are. But more or less, but the truth for both cases are that this is probably the most expensive product that these smallholder farmers have ever bought in their life. First, you need to build the awareness around the technology, that it exists. And then the most important part, you need to build a trust. And that you can only do by in-field sales teams. So sales agents and sales teams, and we have sales and service centers across the country. They need to see. Seeing is believing, as they say in Africa. And they need to see this pump working. And ideally, they need to go to a current customer that has the product that needs to be satisfied. So actually a good chunk of our sales, actually the biggest sales line or incoming sales we have is from referrals. So where a farmer, a current customer is referring a new customer. And that is the easiest way of selling we have seen, just because of this trust. And I think, most of these farmers have been fraudulent salesperson or a bad technology in the past. So build up that trust. It's so important.
There is a company in Cambridge which operates a lot in Africa in smart solar solutions. It's called Azuri. And I've spoken to them at length over the years. One of the big challenges they face is with distribution. Do you do your own distribution, so you have your own sales force, or do you partner with other organizations to distribute your solutions?
We do everything in-house. So we have our own sales team. Obviously, some of those agents are on commission. So it could be a Azuri and a SunCulture agent at the same time. I'm sure that happens a lot. And we have partnered with local logistic company, in Kenya's case, Wells Fargo, which has been incredibly important for us to focus more on the sales, installation, and the customer service. So that logistic part is a critical one. And if you don't have that in this country, which is very often the case, for instance, in Zambia, then you have to suddenly become a logistic company as well, which is a completely different kind of business. That's very important. But apart from that, everything else is in-house. The technicians are full-time, customer service people are full-time, the warehouse staff and the quality insurance and quality checks are full-time. Our shops are full-time. And obviously the overheads with this cost are significant. It's not easy, but we have seen that we need to have it in-house to be able to control each aspect of the business.
And earlier you mentioned M-Pesa. So I imagine that all the pay-as-you-grow financing happens by M-Pesa. Could you tell us how that works?
No, absolutely. M-Pesa has been so key in this and really open up a world of opportunities. Yeah, essentially, the farmers will pay, they will have their wallet on their phone and they will put in our pay bill number and they will pay on a monthly basis. Well, they could actually pay on a weekly or daily basis if they want, but we do every month you reconcile. And then another important aspect of the connectivity is that each of our units has a SIM card inside, so we can see roughly where they are. We can see how much they've been pumping. We can see, if the battery is charged and if the panel is connected, which is important from an after-sale perspective. But the more important part from a financing perspective is that we can unlock the unit remotely. So if they wouldn't pay, and we obviously would call them and check in, like, why have you not paid? What's the challenge? If they then it's up to our relationship manager to decide, okay, will they be able to pay or not? And if they're not, then we will lock the unit remotely. So that side is incredibly important, but also the connectivity overall. And in Kenya, we have incredibly good connectivity, even in rural areas, and which really enables this.
One thing that I have seen sometimes is large non-government organizations buying solar pumps almost in bulk and then distributing it to farmers and sort of managing this payment issue and the distribution issue, taking it on from the company like yours and managing it on their own. Do you see that at all in your business at least?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that was probably from the launch 2012 up to 2016, 2017. That was actually a very big part of business. Tender is being launched by an NGO or through the counties or a project, and you do a grant application. And that was a big part of our business. The problem with that, it's not very scalable. It's a great revenue sales. It makes our life much easier as a company, but it's not very scalable. And that funding goes up and down. And we have actually seen that kind of funding has significantly reduced over the years. It's reducing now, and the funding that is available is more now paid out more as a result-based financing, which I could explain a bit more what that is. But essentially then we are being paid on result. So when we do a sale, when we finance a unit, then we get paid out a preset amount per unit that we can prove that we have done, which is then paid out after we have done the sale. So that's more, I think that structure and how this donor fund is flowing has completely changed since over the last 5 years, I would say.
Yes, we would definitely want to know a little bit about results-based financing. But before that, obviously, one issue around the pay-as-you-go, which you were explaining earlier, is that essentially what you're doing is providing debt to farmers. And companies like yours don't get back-to-back debt from local commercial banks in Kenya. At least that was what it was when I worked with Azuri 3-4 years back. So you had to raise foreign currency capital. And that raises a whole set of issues and challenges. Is it still the case?
Yes. I mean, I would say that foreign debt in foreign currency the availability has gone up. Like it has definitely increased. There's a lot of debt providers out there right now. And the problem is, of course, at what cost? And as you mentioned as well, that it's in foreign currency. And when you have a fluctuating local currency, like we have seen in Zambia a lot, like we've seen in Zimbabwe a lot, it becomes incredibly hard to buy a product in dollars and then finance it over 2 or even over 3 years in the local currency. So that risk is immense. And if you want to hedge against that risk, obviously it's significantly expensive, which you really can't afford in most of the cases.
It is not just in Zambia and Zimbabwe, but it is in the Kenyan shilling, for example, has plummeted against the US dollar in the last several years. So if you as a company, you raise foreign currency debt, your debt goes up. The money that you get from the farmers is in shillings. Either you are going to get really exposed to this risk, or if you go pass it to the farmers, that 20 to 40 will suddenly shoot up. Isn't that the remarkably difficult challenge?
Yes, it is. And we just have to balance it all the time between how much cost can we put over to farmers and what can they afford. And yeah, we did see a massive increase in Kenya. So it's a balance and it's an internal discussion we have all the time on what can the farmers afford and how much risk are we willing to take as a business.
Hack, you indicated at the beginning that impact is very important to you. That's a very important part of SunCulture's mission. What does this actually mean on the ground to the farmers, to their families, to the economy?
Yes, and it means obviously a range of things. But I would say that the initial impact is around the time that they save. Most of these farming households were collecting water manually, with a bucket from a well or from a river, and often done by the women or children of the household. So just by installing a pump and replacing that, we save 17 hours per week. And that can then be used to spend time with the family, go to school, or do other productive farming activities. And then the second one, of course, is the increase we see from the agriculture and from the dairy or livestock that these farmers have. So that is really the first step and the initial what we see from our side.
Do you actually measure these things? Do you monitor these things? Do you report on all this in addition to your financial performance? And what is your legal structure as a firm?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's, many of our investors are impact driven. We do 1 to 2 surveys every year. We measure income increase, quality of life, net promoter score, improved quality of life, and also climate resilience and adaptation is another metric that's become very important over the years. It's an ongoing work, I would say.
So are you a for-profit or are you a social business?
For-profit business, obviously a very impact-driven business, but in the end, we are a for-profit business, yeah.
And your investors, who are they and what do they care about?
They obviously impact-driven, all of them. They obviously believe, and the vision and mission that we have is very important for them. It is a bit mixed. I mean, we do have investors like Hack and SunCulture, who obviously is a non-profit, but even because they are non-profit, they still want to see profit. They want a sustainable model. They still want an exit so they can reinvest that money in other businesses. And then we have more strategic investors like EDF, the French utility company, and Infraco as well, and Factory. And they obviously are for profit as well, but they also have an impact aspect. But I would say that they are more patient capital compared to more commercial investors.
The reason I'm asking these questions is because when you look at bigger multinationals that are listed, there's all this debate about ESG now. And if you take fossil fuel companies like Shell and so on, one of the big challenges for them is how to measure these other types of performance. Financial performance is pretty straightforward. One can always measure that very easily and gets monitored. But some of these impact measures are harder. I don't know if you've had any thoughts on that or any interaction with some of these larger companies, maybe even EDF, for instance, how they view all this.
Yeah, I would say there's been some development on this in the last few years, and I would say it's starting to standardize how impact is being measured. I think there's been some key metrics there. I would say a company like 60 Decibel has actually done a really good job on standardizing these metrics over time. And I would say that most of the investors has been following that lead, and then that has been trickling down to organizations like SNV and GIZ and Shell Foundation as well, for that matter. And so we have seen a good progress there, I would say.
Hack, I'm going to go back to the impact question and ask you, tell us a little bit about the El Nino. You already mentioned the drought in Southern Africa, but Eastern Africa, Kenya has not been spared, not necessarily in a drought, but in floods. Is that what I hear right?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially we had 4 years of drought. And then we had an New year, which was the highest rainfall we have seen in also decades. And we have massive floods in the country, out on the countryside. The northern regions of Kenya was significantly bad. It's the worst of one end, or both two ends, I would say. That's happened to us in Kenya.
So I go back to thinking about, I'm a 1 acre to 2 acre farmer. I have made this purchase of a solar pump. I'm committed to paying out $20 to $40 per month. And then flood happens. How is this farmer ever going to become resilient?
Yeah, from floods, I would say it's an extreme case, right? And I think as long as you're prepared for the flood, which might not be the case, but I think you can really do some mitigation there, ensure that if you have drip irrigation, you collected all the roads up, and obviously, hopefully you're not next to like a mountain, or that you don't have like a huge like mud flood. So there is mitigation there. On drought, obviously, irrigation is part of that mitigation, and using the water that you have in an efficient way. Those are part of mitigation, but it is incredibly hard, these farmers. And it's so sad to see that they are bearing the negative impact of our emissions in the developed world.
Yes. And at this point, perhaps as we are talking about impact, it's best for you to talk a little bit about the results-based financing program that you've been involved with.
Yeah, so obviously all the donors were moving away from this project-based focus, one project, one area, X number of pumps or one big pumps. They wanted to get more value from their money, essentially, the donors. And they wanted to have actual results. To have a result-based financing or result-based grant was a model that was being taken a lot from the solar home system industry. It was even in the health tech industry, I believe, back in the years. Essentially then, they know the impact of each pump. We do the installation, we do the sales and financing installation of that pump. We should submit the data to prove that we have done that. Then there is a verification. I've done that often through a phone call, sometimes a visit, but that has been done and the customer has received the pump at this cost. And then we get paid for doing that work. And this is the most common model today from donor funding.
I'm curious to know what scale you've achieved already. Let's say if you're talking about Kenya, give us a sense of what your reach is and what potential you have for further growth.
To date, we've surpassed around 45,000 units to date on our 7 markets, I would say. 25 to 30,000 of those is in Kenya, so it's by far our biggest market. And the others are then spread out: Uganda, Ivory Coast, Zambia, Togo, and Ethiopia. So that's where we are today. We are seeing really good growth, 20 to 50%, depending on the market, year on year in terms of sales. But obviously it comes with challenges as well. How do we balance the financing versus the sales? How much risk are we willing to take there? Is this existential questions that we have to ask us all the time.
And where do you see the biggest opportunities for reducing costs further and improving your efficiencies?
Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet, I would say. It's everything from the cost of capital that we have mentioned, which very much come from the currency risk as well. It is the cost of the products and the hardware. It's the cost of doing the business and the logistics. And then, of course, it's the subsidies as well. And I think subsidies is a great tool of reducing the price of this product. But it needs to be a smart subsidy, as mentioned before. So not, be shaped in a different way, maybe compared to India, to ensure the water is being managed in a proper way. But that subsidy aspect is so important.
What about things like the second-hand market for batteries as, that takes off around the world? Any thoughts on the circular economy here, reducing, reusing, recycling?
Yeah, absolutely. It's key, and it's something it's a demand, right? Like I think the regulation in Kenya now is that if you are putting a battery out there, you are responsible to get it back at the end of the use. So there's been huge progress on this side. I think obviously from our aspect on the pay-go, if someone can't pay, obviously then we repossess, we refurbish, and we resell that unit. So that's a core and very important part of our business. And then of course we then now have ensure that we have an end buyer for these batteries at the end of their lifetime. So that is now part of our process.
Are there any lessons that Western or developed countries can learn from your experience in Africa?
That's a good question. I think that this vertically integrated, it's a very interesting way, right, to look at it. Very often in Western and developing countries, the companies are not integrated. You will almost never find a sales company selling a hardware product and doing their own financing as well. It's always outsourced to someone else. Or maybe if you buy an electronic component or a tool that needs to be installed, it will always be done by another electrician. And that is a fantastic structure. But I think also by having a holistic structure, you will obviously be able to reduce the cost significantly. You reduce the number of middlemen in that process. So I think that's probably one lesson that can be done. But I also think, obviously, it would be way easier for any company if there was someone who could finance or could install the units that was not within the company.
Yeah, when I've spoken to Simon Bransfield-Garth at Azuri, one of the things he talks about is how in order to succeed in Africa, they've had to actually come up with smart solutions, use a lot of data and sensors and so on to get the most out of the solar power for whatever the solution is. And he says that, that's so much smarter than how we might use lights here in the UK. because here, we just are spoiled on grid energy and don't need to worry too much about efficient use of energy. And of course, in the West, the whole system, the energy system is often very centralized, whereas in Africa, we have a lot of decentralization now. Any thoughts on that, the decentralization, the smart solutions, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as a result of the cost of business in these countries, I mean, in Europe, you will have so good roads. Even if you need to go out and do a repair, it's locally based. You have a very good road to drive there and fix it. But in Africa, the cost of driving out in rural road where you have a mud road, or obviously the cost of doing that repair is so high. So ensuring that you have access to data through the remote monitoring and a good customer service to try to solve it through phone is really, really key. Otherwise, your business model will not work.
Getting back to the point that you're mentioning about trying to reduce costs, and there's no one single bullet, but you did mention in the beginning of the podcast that you're trying to use carbon credits for subsidizing the cost, if you may. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, because I'm very curious about carbon credits. Do they really work?
It's a very good question, and it's obviously become a bit of it's been a wild west, I would say, around the carbon credit market, especially in the clean cooking scene. But obviously, we essentially receive a carbon credit to avoid the avoidance of using a diesel pump. So essentially saying, if a farmer lives off grid, the only way for that farmer to move water is either by a fuel pump or a solar water pump. So by installing a solar water pump, we are avoiding the usage of our fuel. That's the basis that we get it on. And we have now issued our first credit and done sales of our credits. And we almost 90 to 100% of that value we are giving back to the farmer. So for us, it's core part of our business and so important. But as you say, the scrutiny, ups and downs of this market right now is also a high risk one.
What's the transaction cost for this first?
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, obviously, we need to replicate that in each country we want to do this model in, and the cost will go down. Yeah, I think we can probably half that cost. Now we know what we're doing, and also that was the first solar irrigation carbon credit program in sub-Saharan Africa. So there was a lot of new methodology, etc., that we had to go through with Vera. So I think it will go down, but a big problem is for smaller distributors that they can't really access this because it's so expensive.
Hack, we've come to the end of the podcast, so we will turn the tables a little bit. Do you have any questions for us?
I guess what have you seen? I mean, you talk to so many, experienced people that's been in this segment or this part of the world, but also in the energy and agriculture space. What have you seen are some of the biggest challenges? If you want to summarize all the hours that you spent talking to very wise and smart people.
We talk to a lot of people. I think one issue that is coming across to me very clearly, I'm going to turn that question from a challenges perspective to a opportunity perspective, is what I see as the potential for collaboration. I think the situation that we talked about is, NGOs getting funding and then buying pumps, and then, the investment for that going down, the donor investment and the donor interest in that going down. To me, the up and down of the donor industry is such a big problem. And I think if people could get together and put different types of organizations together and develop a little bit of a holistic program, which kind of, if I can use that word, 2 5-year plans over 10 years, that would be a good solution to some of the more systemic issues that we are seeing.
Yeah. And I mean, from my perspective, the thing that I've, heard again and again, ever since I started studying frugal innovation in emerging markets, has been this point about affordability, which is actually more complex than, they don't have the ability to get a loan or something like that. And I think we've discussed some of the complexities of making solutions like yours affordable to people, particularly those on lower incomes and so on. So affordability is obviously a big one, including all the financing issues that you've been talking about, supply chain issues you've been talking about. Then, of course, there's the question that, again, you mentioned early on, which is gaining the trust of your customers, of the farmers, because there's been a lot of bad practice out there, or poor products and solutions, which some of them got burned on and word may have spread. So you have to overcome some of that lack of trust and you have to establish trust. And of course, that's done by showing them, right? As you said, seeing is believing. So those are the two key ones that, I've heard again and again. And I think a lot of your solutions are designed to address those.
Yeah, it's such an important one.
And I'll ask you, Hack, if there's any parting thought for our audience.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's possible. It's possible to do this. I know it's been a lot of negative energy and a lot of negative publicity around this space in the last few years, many companies going under or closing down. But I would have to say still, it's possible. It's extremely hard, but the reward at the end of the road is amazing, and amazing in a way which would not be possible to do in the developing world. And to see the impact you're doing on these farmers and people, it's just truly what keeps you going forward. But then quickly, just on the subsidies, obviously agriculture, as I mentioned before, is one of the most subsidized industries in the world. In Europe, it's the biggest line item. Some Asian countries are spending 4, 5, 6, 8% of the BNP or GDP, on